welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, as part of the series on kinship studies, I am going to talk about kinship systems in India across cultural variations. And this is a part of trying to understand basically the nature of kinship system in India. And most of the time in anthropology, those who have studied anthropology and kinship studies, we see a comparison is being done between North and South because of certain kind of contrast between the two. So we need to understand how these variations help us to understand the structures of society. But before we understand cross-cultural variation, it's important to understand what is kinship and how do we kind of define kinship. In anthropology, we know kinship is defined as a web of social relation. When we say web of social relation, that means two or more individuals are related to each other through certain kind of certain relations. And in anthropology, say classical anthropology, there were two ways in which kinship relations were understood. One was going on by the biological relation, that is, if A and B shared the same blood with C, then A, B, C were forming a network and therefore they were kind of considered as kin relation. And the term used in anthropology was consanguinity or blood relatives. The second way of understanding kinship was the understanding of affinity or alliance. So this was a question of two individuals entering into a relation through the institution of marriage. And the former was most of the time advocate, that is the biological, was kind of given in by British anthropologists like Radcliffe Brown, Mayor Fortis and Evans Pritchard. And the alliance approach, that is trying to understand the relations between members who are through marriage. So we have two kind of relation. One is a kind of biological relations, which is say mother, father, the sister, and then there is another set of relations which is formed due to the relations of marriage. Now every society, this is not kind of same, and therefore one of the important question that anthropologists asked is, do you think kinship is universal? Universal in the sense, yes, the institution of kinship is universal, as it is an institution to be found in all society. There was a kind of an understanding that as society is evolving, kinship was only to be found in primitive society, and modern industrial society was state-based and market-based. Therefore, kinship became a part of the domestic realm. But now we know that it is kind of an understanding that kinship also helps us to understand economic relations, political relations, and therefore the idea that kinship is universally practiced is true, but the way in which it is practiced can be understood as if we try to understand the approaches. So if we go by the biological model, which was propagated by the British anthropologist, we see that kinship was based on blood ties, and therefore it was kind of considered as natural, and the assumption was that such a relation, a blood relation, would be found in all society, and therefore it was kind of universal. When we go into 1970s onwards, and there was a critique of the way in which kinship was studied, and the basic question was to understand whether it was only kind of complete to understand kinship with relation to biology. And this is the time when David Schneider, an American anthropologist, started kind of questioning what is kinship about, and he comes out with a cultural theory of kinship, in which kinship is kind of based on the meaning that we attach. It is abstract, it is not universally the same, and there was a kind of a critique that the understanding of biological kinship as biology was only a Western bias. In many society across in the East and other parts, there are kinship relations which is not necessarily based on blood relations, and therefore there were new ways of understanding kinship, which was in terms of understanding the specificity of a culture. Every cultural practices kind of varies from the other, and it is with this understanding of kinship as culture, kinship as a cultural institution, that cross-cultural comparison becomes significant. How do we then understand if there is variance in one society and the other? How do we then make sense of what kinship is? And therefore comparative method becomes significant. So kinship is universal human institution. That is a fact that we know. but it varies. The way it is practiced, or the relations, the significance of the relations kind of varies from society to society. We'll also see the different ways in which variations are kind of accounted by. It is conditioned by set of norms. So every kinship relations, there are certain norms, there are certain guidelines, rules and patterns which helps us to kind of structure the relation. So as we said in the start, kinship is a web of relation. There are norms, rules which will help you regulate that web of relation. So it is a structured society. Now these rules and norms vary from society to society. So kinship as an institution is present across all society, but there is a variance in terms of the rules, the norms that regulate the web of relation. And when we try to understand that why is there significance in understanding this variation, or what is the work of kinship, is it only limited to understanding how people are related, or how people kind of form a unity, or how do we try to understand the significance of kinship? And that is to help us understand that it regulates the social structures of society. It tells us our roles and responsibility. It kind of concerned with distribution of power and resources, and therefore it kind of helps us to give an order to society. Now, after trying to understand what is kinship and whether kinship is universal, another very relevant question is, why do we need to study variation? Everywhere there are variations, so what is the significance of studying kinship variation? And here, as I already said, that kinship system helps us to allocate role. It helps us identify our responsibility, and therefore it is very important to understand this variation. For instance, if we try to understand what is the relation between a father and the son in a society, is it a formal or an informal, and this will be able to understand the relation between the two individuals by making reference to the type of lineage or the type of descent system that the society follow. And then in the later part of the lecture, we'll see how therefore the relation between the father and the son is different in a patrilineal society and a matrilineal society. So that is how variation will help us understand the context in which relations are structuring society. And in this lecture, the focus is on understanding variation in Indian society, and therefore it becomes very important. As we all know, India is kind of a diverse country with multiple religion, caste and practices. Even there is a kind of an variation in terms of region. So one part of the country kind of varies drastically from the other parts of the other parts, and therefore in order to have a complete understanding of the social cultural realm of Indian society, it is important to understand the variations. And variations kind of not only cannot be only restricted to the domestic domain, because from the domestic domain it also affects the kind of the public relations. For instance, in North India we have the Gotra rule, which is a kind of a understanding where the people who are from the same Gotra cannot marry, and therefore you can kind of have various kind of violence related to the acceptance of any kind of marriage practice which does not accept this rule. So it needs to help us understand not only the domestic realm, but as well the economy, political, as well as the legal regulation of society. So these dimensions lay down the rules of marriages. When we try to understand variation, we'll try to understand what are the rules of marriage in North India compared to what are the rules of marriage in South India and maybe East and West part. It also, kinship helps us to understand the inheritance and succession, and inheritance and succession becomes very important because it is a matter of resource allocation and distribution. So if again kind of trying to understand if there is a line of descent which is through the fathers and which is termed as patrilineal, then it is only the son which could have got rights of inheritance. And because there was a kind of gender imbalance, there was a need to kind of question the traditional laws of inheritance, and the laws were kind of again redefined in terms of giving rights to women, and therefore it kind of helps us to understand the entire structure of the society, whether it be the social structure, the legal structure, the political and economic structures as well. At the same time, variations can also be at the level of religion, and therefore in kind of religious practices, the kinship systems are different, and we helps to understand the how in particular religions particular line of descent is given dominance over the other. So variations not only impact social composition, it not only affects the social relation between members of the society, it also affects resource allocation, resource distribution, right to inheritance, the possession of property, land, ownership of and means of property. So it's kind of has economic dimension, as well as kinship also is helps us to understand power and authority in terms of kind of even trying to understand the lineage, and even in modern contemporary society it helps the family line of leadership helps in kind of being a part of the political system. So it has a economic dimension, it has a political dimension as well, and it kind of helps us. There's a lot of prohibitions and there are a lot of avoidance. So it kind of tells us what are the good norms and what are the code of conduct in society. So whether it be a cultural code of conduct, religious code of conduct, it is through kinship relations that they are kind of implemented or kind of accepted by society. Now giving a background of what is trying to understand through cross-cultural variation, now we'll understand the way in which variations in kinship system has been theorized in anthropology. As I already said, that India is a society with a lot of diversity, regional geographical diversity, linguistic diversity, religious and socio-cultural diversity. And because of this diversity, the methodology of comparison or cross-cultural comparison becomes very important, and India becomes a case study to kind of do a cross-cultural comparison. And as I also said, that the north-south variation is kind of a model to explain a lot of concept, lot of terms in anthropology through the example of what's happening in north and compare it to what's happening in south. But we need to keep in mind that this north-south comparison, these are only kind of models. They are kind of only talking about ideal type. But in empirical reality, or when we actually kind of look into a lot of realities, there is a lot of overflow. There is a lot of over from north to south and vice versa. So looking into the types of variation, we will kind of understand that there are certain dimensions according to which the variations have been understood. Rather, we can kind of understand these as kind of helping us understand the variations in society. And these variations would include geographical variation, that is the geographical variation. As I already said, there is a huge comparison between North India and South India, and we will see that there is a difference in terms of line of descent, lineage system, kinship terminology, rules of marriage and ceremonial exchange. So most of the time this understanding of the entire kinship system is based on these 5 dimensions. When we look into geographical dimension, and here we kind of make reference to Iravati Karve. Iravati Karve's landmark monograph was one of the classical or one of the original understanding of kinship relations in India. She provides a geographical map, rather she divides the entire country into 4 zones. The north zone, the central zone, the south zone and the east zone. And because it is trying to also do it in terms of regional and not in terms of kind of linguistic distinction, because regional will capture a larger area which would be having a common kind of kinship system. So the regional map or the regional mapping that Iravati Karve has done in her classical work Kinship Organization in India, which was published in 1953, we see this mapping of the entire Indian continent is that it gives us distinctive characteristics. It will give us a salient features of kinship system in north, in central India and say south. But when we look into this 4 zone, we see there is a kind of a larger contrast between north and south, and the central and the east zone is kind of either bringing together the features in north and south, or only taking it from north and not taking it from south. So if we are able to understand the comparison between North India and South India, that is, what are the difference in terms of linear system, kinship terminology, marriage rules, and most important, the ceremonial exchange of gift, then we will be able to understand the geographical variance as well. So if you look into this, is reference to Iravati's Karve's work, where she kind of divides the region into 4 zones, and north zone we see that is kind of also making reference to the linguistic differences. And as we are kind of aware that in North India it is by and large Hindi, Bihari, Sindh, Pahari, these are the languages that she has done a linguistic division as well. And looking into the map, if we see central India, we know that it kind of includes Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Orissa. Eastern is prominently the Anamis, Saka, Bhumi, Munda. These are the tribal population which is talking about. And southern we know is the southern part of India, which would include Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. When we look into Kerala, we will see that the Nair of Kerala is an anthropological case study to understand matrilineal system, and Kathleen Gore did a kind of extensive study of the Nair system, and it not only helps us to understand the kinship, it also helps us to understand the institution of marriage. So most of the study of anthropology comes into from the understanding of classical case study of North and South India. So coming back to Iravati Karve, she used linguistic region, caste and family organization to explain the cultural variation in practice of marriage, use of kinship terminology, succession, inheritance, property and gift exchange in India. Now, if we look into these 4 zones that she divides, with kind of a very quick understanding of the features, we see that North India, we know it's a caste endogamy. Endogamy implies that you marry within the caste, but at the level of jati, that is a subcaste, it becomes exogamy, and therefore there is a kind of exogamy, and also incest taboo, that is, you cannot have sexual relation between members of the same subcaste, and therefore it kind of helps us to find a marriage partner outside the subcaste. It is kind of also a rule of prohibition, because it is a kind of prohibiting, it's a negative rule which tells you that you cannot marry certain people, and therefore there is a gotra exogamy that says that you cannot marry within your own gotra. There is a sapindra exogamy, there is village exogamy. So these kind of relations will tell us that there are certain category of relations which are not a marital partner. So it can only have a biological relations with in terms, and a final relations cannot be established. Central India, which is very similar to North India, it is also divided into exogamous group, and some of the castes they follow hypergamy. The hypergamy is a practice whereby the groom, that is the husband side, is of a higher caste than the bride's groom. So unlike North India, they prefer to marry cross cousin. That is why I already said that when we look into the central and the east, there are certain features which comes from north and certain features which will come from South India. So cross cousin is by and large a practice of South India, which is also found in certain tribes of the central India. In central India, there is no variation within the region. For instance, the Jats of Rajasthan follow 2 gotra, and they kind of follow village exogamy. Baniyas follow 4 gotra exogamy, and they kind of follow hypergamy. So there are a lot of contrast within the central zone itself, and therefore the variation is kind of very heterogeneous. When we come to South India, it is by and large a very complex zone, because you will find the predominance of patrilineal system, which is found in Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, and there is also the matrilineal, which is Kerala and Malabar. So you have predominance of both the line of descent in this South India. So here in North India, there is a very clear distinction between family of birth, and this is from a gender perspective. For a woman, she has two families, one family in which she is born, and the second she kind of gets transported into a family which is married, and there is a kind of lot of conflict between the home in which she is born and the home which is married, and lot of gender problems kind of emerge because of the distinction. They are kind of completely two homes which an individual belongs to, and kind of getting adapted or adjusted to a new house also kind of carries with it certain mental and psychological problem. In South India, there is no kind of a distinction, and marriage functions to strengthen the relation between groups. Bilateral ties are given more importance. Bilateral is kind of giving significance to both the sides of relatives, and it is more significant than unilateral tie, which is part of North India. East India, the zone has features borrowed from three of the above, that is from north, south and east, and the Mundaris are the patrilineal, patrilocal, and the Khasis are matrilineal. So when these kind of features we'll find from both north, south and South India. The Ho and Santhal prefer cross cousin marriage, but only till the time when either the father's sister or the mother's brother is alive. So there is a condition to cross cousin marriage in East India. So in contrast to the Ho and Santhal who practice cross cousin, the Bondos do not marry their cross cousin. So there is a kind of prevalence of features from both North and South India. Now after looking into the geographical variation, we try to understand variation in lineage system. Now clan and lineage are basis of group formation, and the way in which the lineage is used varies from society to society. So lineage can be defined as unilineal descent group. Now in anthropology, many a time lineage and descent are used synonymously. For clarity, a clan is a larger group where the ancestors are unknown and all the members would be connected through a common ancestor. Lineage also is a kind of a degree. It could be beyond 8 for great grandparent. Descent group, the ancestor is kind of identifiable and known. So it could be up to the 8th group that the group can be termed as a descent group, but anthropology they are used more or less synonymously. So what does descent mean? That you trace your line of inheritance or connection with one other through blood, that is sharing of the same blood up to a certain known or unknown ancestor. So now this tracing of blood relations or connections could be either through male or female, and therefore that system is known as unilineal. Only one line of descent is used, one line of connection to establish a kind of relation with the ancestor. When both the lines are used, then it is a double descent, and either lines are used in certain point of time. You use the female line, and at certain point you use the male line, then it becomes bilateral or cognatic. So the certain parts of the country, India only, we see it's a predominantly patrilineal. For instance, North India, it's predominantly patrilineal. Almost all society cultures in North India would follow a patrilineal line of descent, which kind of gives the preference to male, and therefore you have the rule of karta, and you even the property inheritance according to the traditional Hindu law Mitakshara, they considered all male members as co-partnerers. South India is predominantly kind of matrilineal, where the female line of lineage is used to establish relation. So when we look into the double descent, where both the line of descent is used, the classical study or case study was given by Daryl Ford. He studied the Yako of South Africa, and he kind of gives in his study in his monograph that the Yako had two groups, a Patri clan and a Matri clan. Now both the Patri clan and Matri clan had equal function in society, so there was no distinction between the female line of descent and the male line of descent. So the Patri clan was used for economic purpose, for kind of having access to resources, and the Matri clan was used for ritual purposes. So both were equally significant. The third kind, which is unilineal, the double, and then the bilateral or cognatic, here both the lines are kind of simultaneously or alternatively used for significance. So it could be a patrilineal or a matrilineal. When we look into the line of descent in anthropology, it is said that the line of descent also determines the residence. So if you have a patrilineal line of descent, then the residence, that is the group formation, would be either patrilocal or virilocal. Now patrilocal is when you form a group or when the woman moves from her home and forms a residence along with the father's group. Here it is generally the husband's father, and virilocal implies a husband. So patrilocal, virilocal is again synonymous. Similarly, in a matrilineal society, it is the residence is either matrilocal, that is residence with mother's group, or exorilocal. Exorilocal is residence with wife's group. Now when we look into line of descent, it helps us to understand gender relation, and Iravati Karve, Leela Dubey, they have shown in their studies the line of descent determines gender relation. So a patrilineal line of descent, patriarchy is kind of functions, and patrilocal descent, so it kind of gives you more significance to the male member. So there is a gender imbalance. Matrilineal is better, but it is again kind of gender imbalance because the weightage is given to the female. So the more egalitarian system would be the bilateral or cognatic system. There is a study by Leela Dubey of the Lakshadweep Islander where there is a more egalitarian relations between the people. So there are a lot of understanding of the kind of relations which is established, and there are a lot of case studies. So we have the Tamil Nadu Paramala Kala study which was done by Louis Dumo, and he does it as a case study for patrilineal system. So we know the patrilineal system is patrilocal, it is exogamous, and the patri clan is a corporate unit, the entire unity. So people, they reside together, all male members have equal right to property, and therefore there is a kind of division which will help us to maintain the unity. The classical case study of matrilineal is Nair, which we know, and the Nair, it is a matrilineal, and Tarawad, which helps us to understand the transfer of property and seeing. Bilateral, we know there are a lot of tribal groups which are given as case studies like Austroasiatic tribes, Bhumji, Kori, Kashi, Santhal, because these kind of also kind of related, and which is a part of another lecture we can see, where the entire development towards patrilineal is also related to the progress of the society. So if we kind of bring back to Frederick Angel's understanding that it is the private ownership of property, or it is the development in property which kind of gives a shift from matrilateral to patrilineal. Even in many parts of South India, we see, because of the impact of modernization, because of globalization, there is a lot of shift towards the patrilineal system. So therefore we help us to understand the cross-cultural variation with reference to descent and lineage. With this, I come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you.